The last choice. The smoke from the dying fires hung heavy in the morning mist, carrying with it the acrid smell of burnt dreams and shattered lives. Margaret Whitmore knelt in the damp earth between two men who had once been everything to her, and now represented the impossible choice that would define the rest of her days. To her left stood Edmund Blackwell, his weathered face etched with lines of authority and bitter disappointment. The silver-haired magistrate's dark coat bore the insignia of the crown, and his leather gloves gripped a rope that had seen too much use in recent months. The same hands that had once caressed her cheek in stolen moments behind the courthouse now trembled, not with age, but with the weight of duty that had consumed whatever remained of his soul. To her right, Thomas MacReady shifted his grip on the worn handle of his woodsman's axe. The tall, broad-shouldered man's face was a mask of controlled fury, his dark hair pulled back to reveal eyes that burned with the fire of a man who had already lost everything and found himself with nothing left to lose. The same strong hands that had built their cabin, that had held her through countless nights when the world seemed too cruel to bear, now held the only thing that might save her, or damn them all. Margaret's breath came in shallow gasps, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. The morning light filtering through the ancient oaks cast long shadows across her face, highlighting the tears that had carved silver tracks through the soot and grime of the longest night of her life. Her simple dress, once her Sunday best, now hung torn and stained with evidence of the choices that had led to this moment. "You know what you've done," Edmund's voice cut through the forest silence like a blade. Each word carried the weight of their shared history, the passionate afternoons in his chambers, the promises whispered in darkness, the gradual realization that love and duty could not coexist in his world. Harboring enemies of the crown, aiding rebels, treason, Margaret, the penalty is death. She had known this day would come. From the moment she had opened her door to the wounded patriot bleeding on her doorstep, from the first time she had passed coded messages through the market square, from every choice that had led her deeper into a web of rebellion and resistance. But knowing and facing the reality were worlds apart. Thomas's jaw clenched, the muscles in his neck standing out like cords. "She's no traitor," he growled, his accent thick with the burr of the Scottish Highlands. "She's a woman with a conscience, something you wouldn't understand, Blackwell." The magistrate's gray eyes flicked to the woodsman with barely concealed disdain. "And you, MacReady, are a wanted man. The bounty on your head would feed a village for a year." His gaze returned to Margaret, and for just a moment, she saw a flicker of the man she had once loved beneath the cold exterior. "But I'm not here for him today." The weight of unspoken history pressed down upon the clearing like a physical force. Margaret remembered the first time she had met Edmund Blackwell, a widower 20 years her senior, distinguished and powerful, who had swept her off her feet with his eloquence and seeming passion for justice. She had been barely 18, the daughter of a blacksmith, dazzled by his attention and the promise of a life beyond her humble origins. Their courtship had been conducted in secret, stolen moments between his official duties. He had spoken of marriage, of a future together, painting pictures of a grand house and children who would want for nothing. She had believed every word, had given him everything she had to give, her heart, her body, her dreams of tomorrow. But promises, she had learned, were fragile things in the hands of ambitious men. When the colonial tensions had begun to boil over into open rebellion, Edmund had chosen his side without hesitation. The crown offered power, position, security, everything he had worked his entire life to achieve. Margaret's growing sympathy for the patriot cause had become first an inconvenience, then an embarrassment, and finally an impossibility he could not tolerate. The night he had told her their relationship was over, that his duty to the crown superseded any personal feelings, Margaret had felt something die inside her chest. Not just love, but faith in the goodness of others, trust in the power of human connection to overcome the darker impulses of ambition and fear. That was when Thomas MacReady had entered her life like a force of nature. She had found him half dead in the forest, his body bearing the marks of a British patrol's attempt at summary justice. Against every instinct for self-preservation, she had brought him to her cottage, tended his wounds, nursed him back to health. In the long nights of his recovery, they had talked about the war, about justice, about the price of freedom and the cost of silence. Thomas was everything Edmund was not. Where the magistrate was polished and calculating, Thomas was rough-hewn and honest. Where Edmund spoke in careful political phrases, Thomas spoke from the heart. Where Edmund's passion had always felt measured and conditional, Thomas loved with the fierce loyalty of a man who understood that tomorrow was never guaranteed. Their love had grown slowly, like a fire carefully tended on a cold night. It began with respect, deepened through shared danger, and blossomed into something that felt as natural as breathing. When Thomas had asked her to marry him, not with flowery speeches or grand gestures, but simply by saying, "I love you, Margaret Whitmore, and I want to face whatever comes next by your side," she had said yes without hesitation. But love, she had learned, was not always enough to overcome the complexities of a world at war. The rebel network that Thomas was part of had needed safe houses, places where messages could be passed and wounded fighters could recover. Margaret's cottage, isolated but accessible, had been perfect. For months, she had played her part in the shadow war, never knowing when a knock on her door might bring salvation or damnation. Last night, it had brought both. The British patrol had arrived just after midnight, acting on information that could only have come from someone who knew her activities intimately. In the chaos that followed, soldiers smashing down her door, Thomas fighting like a demon to protect her, the cottage catching fire in the struggle, 3 men had died. 2 soldiers and 1 patriot, all of them barely old enough to shave, all of them with mothers who would never see them come home. Margaret had been captured, but Thomas had escaped into the forest he knew better than any man alive. The soldiers had brought her to Edmund, knowing of their past relationship, hoping he might extract information that could lead them to the rebel network that had been such a thorn in their side. But Edmund hadn't wanted information. He had wanted her. "I can make this go away," he had said in the pre-dawn darkness of his office, his voice carrying the same tone he had once used to declare his love. "A word from me, and you walk free. We can be together again, Margaret. As we were meant to be." The price, of course, was Thomas's life. And the lives of every other person in the network she knew. Edmund wanted names, locations, everything that could help him dismantle the resistance that had cost so many British lives. Margaret had refused, and now they stood in this clearing where such things were settled, far from the eyes of proper society. "The choice is simple," Edmund continued, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "You can choose duty to the crown and live. Or you can choose this, outlaw, and die beside him." Thomas stepped forward, his axe catching the morning light. "The choice isn't hers to make alone, Blackwell. You want her, you'll have to go through me first." "No." Margaret's voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through the tension like a prayer. "No more killing. Haven't enough people died for this madness?" She thought of the young soldiers from the night before, their faces frozen in eternal surprise. She thought of the patriot who had died trying to protect her, a boy named David who had spoken constantly of the girl he planned to marry when the war ended. She thought of all the widows and orphans this conflict had created, all the mothers who would never again hold their children. "Edmund," she said, turning to face the man who had been her first love. "Do you remember what you said to me the first night we were together? You said that justice wasn't about following rules, but about doing what was right. You said that the law should serve people, not the other way around." His face was stone, but she saw the flicker of recognition in his eyes. "That was before I understood the price of idealism, Margaret. Before I learned that order must come before justice, or there can be neither." "And what order is this?" she asked, gesturing to the rope in his hands. "What justice? You would murder the woman you claimed to love because she chose to help the wounded and feed the hungry." "You chose treason," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "You chose rebellion over loyalty, chaos over order. I chose conscience over convenience," Margaret replied, her voice growing stronger. "I chose to help people instead of helping systems that crush people. If that's treason, then I'm guilty. But I'm not the one who should be ashamed." Thomas watched the exchange with growing understanding. This wasn't just about him and Margaret. This was about the war that had torn apart not just the colonies, but individual hearts and souls. This was about the way violence begot violence, the way choosing sides in a conflict could destroy the very things people claimed to be fighting for. "She's right, you know," Thomas said quietly, lowering his axe. "This war has made monsters of us all. But we can choose to stop being monsters. We can choose to remember what we're supposed to be fighting for." Edmund's laugh was bitter. "Pretty words from a man who killed 2 soldiers last night." I did," Thomas admitted, his voice heavy with regret. 2 boys who should have been home helping with the harvest instead of burning cottages in the middle of the night. You think I'm proud of that? You think I sleep easy knowing their families will never see them again?" For a moment, the 3 of them stood in silence, each lost in their own thoughts about the choices that had brought them to this place. The morning sun climbed higher. burning away the mist and revealing the full scope of the forest around them, ancient trees that had stood for centuries, that had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations, that would continue long after all of them were dust. What if, Margaret said slowly, an idea forming in her mind. What if there was another way? Both men looked at her, and she saw in their faces the desperate hope of people who had been fighting for so long they had almost forgotten what peace might look like. The war can't last forever, she continued. Someday, there will need to be forgiveness. Someday, people on both sides will need to find a way to live together again. What if we started that healing here? What if instead of adding more death to the account, we chose to break the cycle? Edmund shook his head. Idealism again, Margaret. The world doesn't work that way. Because people like you decide it doesn't work that way, she shot back. Because when faced with the choice between justice and expedience, between mercy and vengeance, between love and power, you choose the easy path every time. Easy. Edmund's composure finally cracked, revealing the anguish beneath. You think any of this is easy? You think I wanted to be standing here with a rope in my hands, ready to. He couldn't finish the sentence, and Margaret saw the truth that he had been hiding from himself. Whatever else he had become, whatever compromises he had made with his conscience, some part of him still loved her. Some part of him was as broken by this moment as she was. Then don't do it, she said simply. Walk away, let us go. Tell them you couldn't find us, that we disappeared into the forest. The war will end eventually, and when it does, you won't have to live with the knowledge that you murdered an innocent woman for political convenience. Innocent. Edmund's voice was raw. 3 men are dead because of the choices you made. How is that innocent? And how many more will die because of the choices you make here today? Margaret countered. If you kill me, Thomas will never stop hunting you. He'll become everything you say he already is, a killer, a terrorist, a man with nothing left to lose. And if you kill him too, then everyone in his network will know that compromise is impossible, that mercy is weakness, that the only language the Crown understands is violence. She took a step closer to Edmund, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. But if you let us go, if you choose mercy over vengeance just this once, then maybe, just maybe, others will see that there's another way. Maybe some other magistrate will remember your choice when he's faced with his own moment of decision. Maybe some other rebel will choose to spare a soldier because he remembers hearing about the day when an enemy chose forgiveness over duty. Thomas watched the struggle playing out in Edmund's face, duty warring with conscience, ambition battling against the fading embers of love, the weight of empire pressing down against the simple human desire to do the right thing. She's offering you redemption, Blackwell, Thomas said quietly. The chance to be remembered for something other than the blood on your hands. The chance to break the chain of violence instead of forging another link. For a long moment, Edmund stood frozen, the rope hanging loose in his hands. Margaret could see the battle raging behind his eyes, the cost of mercy weighed against the cost of cruelty, the price of following orders measured against the price of following his heart. Finally, with a sound that might have been a sob or a curse, Edmund let the rope fall to the forest floor. Go, he said, his voice broken. Go now, before I remember my duty to the Crown. Margaret felt tears streaming down her face, but these were different from the tears of fear and desperation she had shed through the long night. These were tears of gratitude, of relief, of hope that maybe, just maybe, the world could be better than the worst of human nature. But Thomas hadn't lowered his axe. His eyes were still fixed on Edmund with the wariness of a man who had learned not to trust the promises of those in power. What surety do we have? Thomas asked. How do we know you won't change your mind the moment we're out of sight? How do we know there isn't a company of soldiers waiting just beyond those trees? Edmund looked at him with something that might have been respect. You don't, but I give you my word, the same word I gave to Margaret once, before I learned to break promises like kindling. I won't pursue you, I won't send others to pursue you. As far as the Crown is concerned, Margaret Whitmore died in the fire last night, and Thomas MacReady disappeared into the wilderness. And the network? Margaret asked. The people I worked with. I know nothing about any network, Edmund said, meeting her eyes. My investigation died with you. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't a guarantee, but it was a chance, perhaps the only chance they would get. Thomas finally lowered his axe, though he kept it ready. If you're lying, Blackwell, if this is some kind of trap. If I'm lying, Edmund interrupted, then I suppose you'll kill me. And perhaps I'll deserve it. But I'm not lying, MacReady. I'm tired of being the kind of man who solves problems with rope and gibbet. I'm tired of looking in the mirror and seeing a stranger wearing my face. Margaret stepped forward and, to the surprise of both men, embraced Edmund gently. It wasn't the embrace of a lover, but of someone saying goodbye to a part of her past that had shaped her but no longer defined her. "Thank you," she whispered. "For letting me go. For letting us both go." Edmund stood rigid for a moment, then his arms came up briefly to return the embrace. When they separated, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Be happy, Margaret," he said. "Be happy in a way I never learned how to be." Then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the forest like a ghost returning to haunt someone else's dreams. Thomas and Margaret stood alone in the clearing, the morning sun now bright and warm on their faces. The danger wasn't over. There would be other patrols, other magistrates, other moments when the war would intrude on their attempt to build a life together. But for now, they were alive, they were free, and they were together. "Do you think he meant it?" Thomas asked, watching the direction Edmund had gone. "I think he wants to mean it," Margaret replied. "And sometimes, that's enough to make the difference." Thomas pulled her close, and she could feel the tension leaving his body as the reality of their survival began to sink in. "Where do we go now?" he asked. Margaret looked around the clearing, at the dying embers of the fires from the night before, at the rope lying abandoned on the forest floor, at the ancient trees that had witnessed their moment of grace and would carry the memory long after they were gone. "West," she said finally. "Beyond the reach of this war, to a place where we can build something new. A place where the choices of the past don't have to define the possibilities of the future." As they walked away together, hand in hand, Margaret thought about the strange arithmetic of mercy, how choosing not to kill could be more powerful than any act of violence, how forgiveness could be more revolutionary than rebellion, how love could triumph not through conquest but through the simple act of letting go. Behind them, the forest began to reclaim the clearing, grass and wildflowers growing up around the abandoned rope, nature's gentle way of erasing the evidence of human cruelty and human grace with equal indifference. But the choice that had been made there, the decision to break the cycle of vengeance and create space for something better, would ripple outward in ways none of them could imagine. Years later, when the war was over and the wounds began to heal, there would be stories told in taverns and parlors about the magistrate who chose mercy over duty, the rebel who laid down his axe, and the woman who taught them both that courage wasn't about facing death, but about choosing life, not just for yourself, but for your enemies as well. It wasn't a perfect ending. There would be other dangers, other conflicts, other moments when the worst of human nature would rear its head. But it was a beginning, proof that even in the darkest times, even when the whole world seems bent on violence and vengeance, individuals can choose to be better than their circumstances, better than their fears, better than the sum of their past mistakes. And sometimes, that's enough to change everything.